Hello and welcome back to the Late Night Cool Down. I'm your host Kyle Antoine, and today's episode is called Tall Tales, a collection of stories most deem unexplainable. Now this episode is diving into the paranormal, things that I have personally experienced, and you can take it how you want it. I'm just telling you what happened, and I'm not telling you to come to any conclusions, but by human logic alone, these stories are deemed unexplainable. Now, I just want to take a second to apologize for the late upload. I learned the lesson: record, pre-record, and then schedule for upload. Don't wait until the day of to record, especially on Sundays. Sundays tend to be very busy. I go to church in the morning, and then yesterday was especially busy. It was a good kind of busy, so I just didn't really get the chance to sit down and record. And I do like recording day of. I think it gives it a more authentic feel, but sometimes I just can't do it, and I'd rather, record a few days or a couple days before day of release, so I know that on the day of release, there's going to be an episode for you guys, and we're really going to be, tighten up the ship, or, getting the ship together for season 2, because this is going to be, our biggest season yet. We're going to have a lot of good people on, and we're going to, have a lot of fun, and it's going to be really good. So without further ado, let's get into it. So my first story is a UFO story. Now, this story happened in the Comox Valley, and at the time, I was with someone, and I was looking out their window. And along the horizon, I saw what looked to be a flying saucer. And it was literally like the flying saucer, like in the movies. Like it was, a saucer, silver. But this flying saucer had almost like these rings of energy around it, and they were gold and shimmering in, color. And I literally watched it go from, where it was when I looked at it, behind these, very tall trees. Like there was 2 trees that were very tall, and it goes behind it, and then it just doesn't come back out. And it had seemed like it just disappeared. And with the person I was with was my ex, and we were in an argument for whatever fucking reason. And as I'm watching this shit, I'm like, yo, we can continue the fight after, but just come look at the fucking UFO out your window. And he didn't, but I saw it, and I was like, oh my God, what is that? So that's one story. And, after every story, I'm probably going to, talk about it, get a little philosophical, and, ask some questions. And so I have family. I'm not going to name who they are. I'm not going to say their name or, who they are to me. But I have family who have had their own experiences. And so one of them was that they were, a child, probably around 5 or something, and they were in their neighborhood hanging out with their friends, and they were on their way to a friend's house. And as they are, pulling up to the house, they look, and there's this flying saucer just kind of, right above their friend's house. And, they were children, so they didn't really, comprehend how, paranormal this was, or, out of the ordinary it was. And so they tell the mother whose, house it is, and she separates them and sits every, kid down and asks them to draw what they saw. And everybody drew the same thing, which is actually incredibly smart. if you think about it, like, how can you tell if a kid's, if a group of children are telling the truth on something like this? Get them to draw, separate and get them to draw, because, you can be like, hey, like, but like, if they, you know what I mean, right? So that was a pretty cool experience that this person had. And so the other family member had an experience where they were, I think it must have been somewhere in, like, the interior of British Columbia. And what happened was they were driving down the highway, and all of a sudden, this, UFO kind of flies and hovers above their car. And it doesn't do anything, but it just hovers over the car. And they're like, what the hell is going on? And so that's, those are, a collection of, like, flying saucer, like, because I saw it, they saw it, like, and I don't have any, I'm mentally sound. I'm not, I don't have any mental health issues that would, cause me to see things that aren't there or hear things that aren't there, And I just want to put that that out there. And neither do the people who told me these stories. And, like, we don't have anything to really gain from sharing, these stories to each other, in personal one-to-one, right? It's just the unexplainable through human logic alone. Because human logic, especially in the modern age, is UFO. I mean, actually, in recent years, it's been becoming more accepted that there's probably something out there, whatever that is, but something is going on, paranormal, right? Something that, with, like, the declassified documents from the U.S. Navy and, the U.S. military and intelligence kind of admitting that, there is something going on. We don't necessarily, and they probably do know what's going on, but to the public, they say, we don't know what it is. We're acknowledging that, it is a national security concern. And I also want to clarify, I don't think these flying saucers or these other experiences with what would probably be extraterrestrial life, I don't think they're evil, okay? And I got my own kind of thing surrounding that. And so the other experiences with what you would call UFO, which is, unidentified flying object or unidentified aerial phenomenon, which is the most recent term they use, the U.S. government uses. So this other experience with UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomenon, UAP, I was in Courtney again, and I was with, I think, 3 of my friends. So there was 4 of us total. And we were in the park across my house at the time. And I see in between, I look out across the horizon, and Courtney is in a valley, right? And so, if you're in higher areas, you can see farther. But anyways, we were kind of up above a bit in the parking lot of this park. And we're looking out, or I'm looking out, they're ahead of me. But I'm looking out, and I see what looks to be almost like a star in between 2 trees. And it wasn't a star, but, like, it had, like, this, like, it could have been a star, like, but I'm looking at it, and I had, prior experiences with what I call the white orbs. Now, I don't 100% know what these white orbs are. What I do know is that I've seen them do, kind of miraculous things that humans with our current technology aren't able to do. And I stop and I'm staring at this thing because I'm like, what is that? And then it starts moving. And it moves kind of closer to us. And then I watched it go kind of up a bit in the sky, and then it split off into two. So now there were two orbs, white orbs, and like and these things are massive, by the way. Like I call them white orbs because that's the literal, like what they look like. And I'm trying to do my best to detail the story, like what they look like and what they did to the best of my ability, so that you kind of get an image, or in your head of what I saw. And so we're walking, and we're literally watching this thing go across the skyline, and then kind of, I would say like with like 150 feet or something, like in the air, like it was a decent distance away, but it was local. It wasn't outside the atmosphere, if this, whatever it was. And it wasn't a plane, and it wasn't a helicopter. It was, what I call the white orbs. And so it went up, split off into two, and then the one that split off kind of came down and then started running on this like horizontal trajectory. And as it was doing that, it turned from white to red. So this white orb turned red in color. And then all of a sudden, this, like, the best way I can describe is like a force field got projected around it from it. And then it continued along this trajectory. And then I think it went back along its trajectory and went back the way it came from, and then disappeared. And then the white one, the original one that didn't split, or that wasn't the one that was split off, the original white orb, dropped down towards the ground of the earth and disappeared. And like I was almost expecting it to make a sound. Like that's how close it was. And that's how visual it was. And it just drops down to the ground and disappears. What the heck is that? And I am not, I'm mentally sane, I'm mentally sound, and I was at the time of these events as well. It's just to, have some clarity in the situation. Like I wasn't the only one who saw it. There's 3 others with me who also saw it. And I don't know what they remember. I don't know if they remember at all. I don't know what they saw for themselves. I'm only telling you what I know I saw. And what the heck is that? And I think these experiences with unidentified aerial phenomenon is much more common than we acknowledge or think. But, people are scared to be like, yo, I saw this. Because there's been, a lot of kind of, dare I say, propaganda. Something of that, similar kind of thing where, it's not really accepted to talk about things like these. And so that's kind of like, the point of today's video is to be like, hey, I saw these things. And I'm not saying I know 100% for sure what they were, but I am saying I saw them. And you can take it how you want it, right? And so like, I've had, numerous experiences of, unidentified aerial phenomenon. I haven't so much recently at the time of this recording. And also I haven't been out. I have been out, but I haven't been out where you can really see the sky clearly. And I haven't intentionally looked for anything in the sky. But, this happened, when I was younger. So, what was going on? And it's not like it's, in my mind constantly. And, honestly, this is kind of the first time I've actually really thought about those experiences. And it's honestly kind of surreal to reflect back and, acknowledge that, these things actually happened. And, I'm 21 now. I was probably around 16 or 17 years old when these things occurred. And, well, 15 to 16. And, looking back with, a more adult and more, matured brain, it is a bit surreal to acknowledge. I did, witness these things. And, I wasn't the only one. So before we continue on, I just want to take, a couple minute break to thank everyone for 100+ streams and downloads on Spotify alone. So our top geographic locations have been updated. So the number one country that listens to me is the United States of America. Shout out, 45% of my total audience is from the United States. Coming in at second place, good old Canada. I love you, Canada. Coming in at 24.8%. And our third country is Vietnam. Shout out, 22.9%. That's crazy. Shout out Vietnam. Like we're now a truly international podcast. I know when we hit 50, total streams and downloads on Spotify, the only countries were the U.S., Canada, and Russia. But now it's been updated. So now third is Vietnam. And coming in at fourth is Uzbekistan at 2.8%. Shout out to Uzbekistan. I honestly do not know much about your country. I will definitely be doing some, further research into this because, I wonder, what is it that resonates with, these other countries? Maybe I don't know. I'll look into it. Thank you. And coming in at fifth place is Russia at 0.9% of, my viewers comes from Russia. And also at 0.9%, coming in at sixth place is Ghana. Shout out Ghana. Shout out Africa. Coming in at seventh is Morocco at 0.9% as well. Shout out Morocco. I also don't know much about your country either. I will do some further research. And coming in at eighth place is India. Shout out to the Indians. For Indian to Indian. I'm not Asian Indian. I'm native Indian or American India. Turtle Island Indian, actually. But, shout out to my Indian brothers and sisters. It means the world to me. I really love your country. And, thank you for tuning in. And I have a deep respect for your cultures and your customs and your beliefs and everything. And, India, for some reason, has a really bad rep, especially in Canada. And I just want to take a sec to acknowledge that. And I just want to say that some of the most kind and caring individuals I have met were Indian people. When I did a TikTok live overnight in New Westminster, I chose to stay outside through the entire night on TikTok live. I was sitting outside a gas station charging my phone, and at least a dozen cars passed me by. At least a dozen cars, and the first hour I was there, and the only one who stopped and asked if I was okay was an Indian person. Not that it mattered. I'm not one that's but it does matter because, it was someone who comes from, an upbringing, a culture, a perspective on the world where they came out of their way to ask if I was okay. Because most Canadians, white or not, but most Canadians just don't care or, they don't want to get themselves involved. It's going to be too much. But, Indians come from a very, respectful and a very caring culture for the most part. I know that, like every country, there's, some more extremist views or beliefs, which is, I'm not going to get into that, but, I just want to, shout out to India and the Indian people who are here. And, thank you for, for the most part, always being super kind. Like, I don't think I've ever really had like a horrible experience with an Indian person. It's not true for some other groups of people. And I say this not as coming from, a racist perspective of, I love everybody, but there tends to be, certain groups of people who obviously come from certain cultures or upbringings who have been, very nasty or very rude to me. And that's not a reflection on, where they come from, but it's just a reflection on who they are, and what they their upbringing. So I hope that made sense. And, shout out India. And so I think this is 10. 10th place is Kuwait at 0.9%. So thank you thank you to all my, top 10 countries. So this is across all platforms, not just Spotify. On Spotify, it's just Canada, 100%. So shout out my Canadians. It means the world. And obviously it means that, something I'm saying is resonating with people, internationally, multinational interest, which is incredible. And we'll get more into, this in the final episode of season 1, the finale. But let's get back into these paranormal, unexplainable stories. So my next story is a bit different than the UFO stories, and the story occurs in 2023. And so, pardon me, I was hanging out in my backyard, and I was probably only like 10 or 11 at night. I was alone, hanging out on my deck, in my backyard. And, all of a sudden, I start hearing what sounds like plastic grocery bags crinkling. And, they're way less common now. But if you grew up in Canada over the last even 10, 20 years, you know what those plastic grocery bags sound like when you bunch them up. It makes that almost staticky sound, right? And that's what I heard. And it kind of got a bit louder. It started and it just kept going. And I honestly had assumed and thought, I'm like, is there, a homeless person, chilling out in my neighbor's yard? Because that's what it sounded like. I was like, are they hanging out in someone's backyard? And they just got some snacks and food, and there's opening up everything. And so it doesn't go away. And I'm trying to put myself back into the memory of it. And so essentially what happened was I shine my light in that direction, where it sounded like it was coming from, the sound. And I see what looks to be a very elongated cat, which sounds weird. And it wasn't a normal cat, and it wasn't a normal animal either. And I'll explain why in a sec here. And so this thing kind of jumps over the fence, and as soon as I see it, and I think by this time I had the porch light on, and I was trying to see what's going on. I think before, right when I was hearing the sound initially, I had it off, and then I turned it on. And so I see this, very long thing, and it wasn't extremely long, but it was, I would say it's about 4 feet long. It wasn't, and it resembled a cat. But I've never seen a 4 foot long cat, house cat, I might add. And it wasn't a raccoon, it wasn't a cougar, and it was making this staticky sound. And when I saw it, it was something, it wasn't a primal fear. It was a spiritual, in my body, this is something that I can't explain. This is something that's a danger, and this is something that, I have never felt this before, and I haven't felt this since, thankfully. But I could feel like the nerves in my back get fired up. That's like the nerves in my back, like understood, like whatever the fuck this is something that I probably shouldn't mess around. And, I need to keep an eye out. And this fucking thing that I was looking at climbed up this, big tree that's like in between the fence line of like the neighbor's house and the house that I lived in at the time. And, scurried up the fucking tree real quick, actually. And it was making this staticky sound. And that staticky sound is really what, put my nerves on alert mode. And it's hanging out in the tree. And this is like, spring, summertime. And so this tree had all of its leaves. And so I couldn't really see into the tree. I couldn't see where in the tree it was, but I knew it was watching me. And so I hit up the group chat and I'm like, yo, come upstairs. To like my sister, I was like, yo, come upstairs. There's, I think, what is a skin walker or something, hanging out in the tree. And so so they come upstairs and I tell them what I saw. And of course, like, they didn't see it. But when they left, I was like, I know what I saw. It has to be in the tree. And so I'm shining my light, my phone flashlight into the tree. I'm trying to find, like, I'm trying to see it, essentially. And I honestly kind of was like, okay, maybe I am tripping a little bit. And it's funny how we always second guess ourselves when we experience something. Like, no, I know what I saw. And so, anyways, I'm shining my light. And my light hits whatever this creature, it hits the creature's eyes. And its eyes reflect the light back to me. But it wasn't, you can look up what different animals, what their eyes look like when a light is, shown in their direction and they look at it. And it's typically a yellow reflection. This creature that I was, that was in my tree, its eyes reflected back pure white. And I even got a video. It's somewhere on one of my old TikToks. But in the video, you can see its eyes reflected back to me. And let's take a second to pause here. For a sec, I'm going to take a sip of my tea. So let's do a quick, simplified list of this experience. A, it was at night. B, I heard this weird static sound. C, I saw this weird creature that looked to be like a cat that was, longer than a cat, but wasn't a cougar or any other animal. And I know that for a fact. And C, it watched me in the tree, and it didn't show itself to other people, only to me. And then I'll add, it looked like a shadow figure almost. Like it had the eyes that reflected back, yes. It scurried up the tree, yes. It made audible sounds, yes. But it was almost as if I could almost see through it in a way. So my conclusion then and my conclusion now is that it was some sort of spiritual being, and for whatever reason came and visited me that night. I don't know what kind of entity it necessarily was. I did not get like an evil feeling. Like I'm an empath. Like and I have clairsentience, which is, clear feeling. Like I feel energy, not just from others, but from, other things and situations and things like that, right? And so I didn't get like a feeling that this thing was evil, But I got the feeling that I needed to be alert and I needed to, not be stupid in my dealing with this thing. And I call it a thing because I don't know what it was. And so, and let's take a step back for a sec. A cat, I grew up with cats. I live with cats right now. I've never experienced a cat that was super long. I never experienced a cat that, made that kind of staticky sound. And I never met a cat whose eyes reflect back pure white. And so, to finish this story, my sister goes back downstairs. I'm alone on the deck again. And my dog was outside with me. And my dog likes to square up to the raccoons and, different animals. And I'm like, if this thing gets around my dog, I don't think my dog is going to live or survive, the encounter if my dog decides to run towards it or attack it. And so I brought I wasn't fearful, but I was, concerned, and I knew, this, intrinsic level of that, I needed to make sure my dog was safe. Because this is obviously an unknown creature to me, and it's, obviously by that nature of not being known to me, it's unpredictable. I don't know what it's capable of. And so I bring my dog inside, and I was like, I need to figure out what this is. And so I watched this thing, and it was literally staring at me. Like when I shone the light and its eyes reflected back to me, that meant it was staring right at me through the trees, which is honestly pretty terrifying, looking back. And so this thing, for whatever, I don't know why, I don't know the why, I just know the what. And so this thing, comes down the trunk of the tree again and then hops over the fucking fence. And then it's gone. And at the time, it just looked like it hopped, and it literally ran down the tree. And I was like, holy fuck, is it, coming up my deck stairs? Because the stairs coming from the back, going from the backyard ground up onto that main deck, right? And I'm like, and I literally got scared. I'm like, oh fuck, it's coming for me. But it hopped over the fence. And so a cat, and I've taken a cat out of that exact tree, a handful of times throughout my life. And I know cats can't run down a tree, and they can barely get down from a tree, period, let alone run down it once they get up there, especially where it was. It wasn't super high up either. It was almost at eye level to me. Because, the deck's up there, and so the branch was probably a bit above, the deck. But, what was that? And that's something that even, through my spiritual lens, that spiritual outlook that I have, I can't explain what it was. And I've never really heard of anybody else's stories in person or online that kind of resemble this story that I have. I don't know why. I don't know what it was. I know what happened. I don't know what it was. But I do know it wasn't a cat. It wasn't a raccoon. It wasn't any animal that I've seen IRL or online. It's not something that I've read about. That static was it triggered something in my spine. When I heard it, this surge of whatever went up my spine and branched out to the nerve endings in my back, kind of hey motherfucker, you need to watch out for this, whatever that is, and it wasn't a primal fear either. I mean, maybe that was primal, but it felt spiritual. If that's like the best I can explain it. So like, what was that? And at the time, I kind of just said, skinwalker, which I have heard and I've been told you're not really supposed to say skinwalker. But when I say that, most people kind of know what I'm talking about. So that's why I say it. And so I don't think it was a skinwalker. Like, I didn't get like an eerie feeling or a scared feeling. It's just like, this is something, you need to look out for. And it made weird noises and it did weird things, and it watched me for like 15 minutes and then just decided to leave. And an intelligence that was almost probably on par with human intelligence. Like, it was very conscious. It was very aware. It knew what it was doing. It probably knew it was freaking me out with the static sound it was making. So, email latenightcooldown.mgmt@gmail.com if you have any idea what this could be. So, my next story is a story, I think I was probably in grade 6. And I was in the forest near a middle school that I would eventually end up at like a year or two later. Or a year. If I was grade 6, it would have been a year. But I'm in the forest, and I can't really remember if I was with anybody. And I forget why I was there in the first place, like how I ended up there, because it's a small town, but I don't really live like really near it. It's probably like at least a half-hour walk from my house. So I don't remember exactly what I was doing. But, I'm walking through this forest, and it's, dead quiet. I think it's probably summertime, and no one's around. It's just me. And I'm looking around like the trees, like it was, a bright summer day, but you're in the forest, so everything's a bit darker, right? Obviously. And so I see what appears to be, shadow figures, popping, like, behind the tree. And then when I look, they kind of like disappear. I would assume behind the tree again. And it just kept happening. And I'd be looking around, and I would see like shadow figures like pop in and out behind the trees. And so much so that I got disoriented. I got almost dizzy from, looking at these things, because I'm like, whoa, like what is going on? And I just got this feeling of unease, unsettled. And, I got out of there real quick. I was like, I don't want to know what those things are. And, at the time, I wasn't, in a psychosis or anything. I just, put these clarifications because I want to shut down immediately any thinking that, these things weren't real or weren't at least, happening. I don't necessarily know what they were, but what they looked like, I can tell you for sure. And what they did, I can tell you for sure, is that these look like shadow figures behind these, trees. And every time I would look at them, they would disappear. And it only happened in that forest. And I haven't really experienced anything like that since, where, I'm standing in a forest by myself in the daytime, and I see things, moving behind, like, standing beside the tree and then moving behind it. When I, went to like actually directly look. So I don't know what that was or anything. And then when I, was a student at that middle school, I, walked through the same area a bunch of times, and it was almost like I know they were doing landscaping, but it literally looked like a completely different forest from that initial experience, which is just, can be easily explained by like, landscaping that they do. But it was just a bit like, I remember walking there like a year later and remembering that experience, and I'm like, this looks completely different. because it literally did. My apologies. Pardon me. So that's another experience. Another experience happened probably like 4 years later. And so at this time, around 2021, I would always hang out in this forest. And it was a very massive forest. And I had this hammock that me and my friends, a year, or a handful of months prior in the summertime, put up. And so I would, go hang out in the forest and listen to music on my phone. I just kind of like meditate and enjoy being in nature. And so in this forest specifically, in the daytime, everything would feel fine and normal, and even light, right? And then as it got closer to darkness in the evening, this feeling of being watched and this feeling of, I almost want to say impending doom was the feeling. Like, that's what I can describe it as. But a feeling that, if I were to stay, past dark, something would come for me or something would happen to me. And so I would always, once that feeling kind of grew to a certain point, I knew it was time for me to leave. And then, I would leave. And so this one night, I guess I fell asleep, or I was too busy like meditating, because when I got into the forest, it was light out. But I guess I had my eyes closed, and I kind of lost track of time. And I opened my eyes, and it's completely dark. And I'm like, oh my God, I need to get out of here. Because, aside from the paranormal, that forest and its location, it's prime for a bear or a cougar or, some, form of wildlife that will actually, if given the right circumstances, will attack you. So aside from the paranormal, there's an actual physical, threat at night there. And so I got scared, obviously. So I, get my things together, and it's essentially pitch black. I'm in the middle of a forest, and it's nighttime. It's literally pitch black. So I have my flashlight, and, I'm navigating my way back. And of course, during this time, it's a bit flooded. And so along the trail I was on, people would put, logs or different things like that for people to step on, so they're not walking through probably in some areas they're a foot of water. And so, I was having to carefully navigate my way through this essentially a bridge of logs and things, to make my way out. And then once I got through that part of the trail, it kind of opens up into this bigger area, and I couldn't find my way out. And thankfully, I remembered literally the day before, I noticed there was reflecting tape or some sort of reflecting thing that someone put on the trees. And so thankfully, I shone my light, and I found them, and it led me out. And as soon as I exited the forest line onto the trail, and it opens up into this pond area and neighborhood kind of thing, I felt relief. I was like, oh. The second that I left the forest boundary, I was like, oh, I made it. But something in that forest, there's something going on, aside from a bear or a cougar or something, because I've been there with friends, and this one experience, we went down this embankment, not a major one, but it was an embankment, and down into the main forested area, and we're walking, and then all of a sudden they turn around and their eyes are wide, and they're like, shh, and they're like, go, go, go. And I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, there's a bear right there. They had gotten down and they looked to the right and there was a bear. So like, there's like, it's not just, paranormal, that there's an actual threat there. But, I've been there, a handful of times, and I would sometimes get the feeling, even, before, darkness started settling, where I felt, somewhere in the forest, maybe not too close, but somewhere, there was something watching me, waiting for me to slip, literally like slip on something in the water, and that's going to come snatch me. And then allegedly, someone told me that a girl, when she was, in elementary school, so, we can, 7, 8, 9, 10 maybe, had, and trigger warning, committed suicide in that forest. And, I don't know what her beliefs are, but God bless her soul. Whatever is to come after, I hope she found peace. But some pretty dark things have happened in that forest that may be contributing, to this vibe in there. And another experience someone told me was that they saw a deer, and the side that that was facing them looked normal, and then it turned its head, and like all of like the left side of its face was like decayed and dead and like mangled, right? And so you may think skinwalker, which may or may not be what this deer was, but for sure we know that there is a disease that animals can catch where that happens, where part of their face decays, or as part of their body decays, and like the rest of it's living, but it's in those areas is decayed and dead. And so they saw this thing and like immediately got unsettled, right? Like, who wouldn't? And another experience in the forest was The Forest and Courtney by Walmart. Now, again, in the daytime, it is a beautiful walk to take your dog, to just look at the scenery, to go hang out by the river. Maybe don't swim in it because it's a bit gross, but it's a really beautiful area. And for the most part, like, most people don't go there because there was, a homeless population there for a bit. And so people are kind of wary of going on. But in the actual like main area, it's pretty like, nobody's really around ever, not even homeless people. And it's very beautiful. But in the nighttime is when things kind of get, watch out. Because as beautiful as it is, it's, it's not massive, but it's, pretty big for, compared to other parks or forested areas that you can go walk around. I mean, honestly, in Courtney, there's massive, but this one's, I would say, a medium-sized kind of forested area. And so if you don't know where you're going, I mean, there's only like, 2-3 main trails. But if you decide to venture off one of the main trails, you can easily get lost. And so in the nighttime, I've been there, and it literally feels, again, like you're being watched by something. And it's not just, oh, there's an animal there, but it's like there is some entity or something that is watching me. And, when I went there, And I got the feeling that I shouldn't go off this one main trail. And it doesn't go deep in the forest. Like you're always within about 15 feet of a road on this trail. But I just had this feeling like, don't go any further. And it's not even that maybe something, and oftentimes when I get these feelings that I shouldn't do something, like, too deep in the forest, it's not necessarily that something's going to happen to me. It's more so like I'm not welcomed. I'm not allowed. I'm not welcomed to go any further into the forest. And I'm even pushing it a bit, by being on that trail anyway. But it's a weird, bizarre, paranormal feeling where it's like, okay, I know I probably shouldn't, and I'm not even welcomed. It's not that I'm going to get harmed necessarily, but I'm not welcome. And so to give a bit of background to Courtney and Comox, the Comox Valley, is the indigenous teachings and stories of that land. Now, this is just a story, and I don't think it's been verified, but there's a place called Forbidden Plateau, and it's probably about a 20-minute drive from Courtney. So I actually just pulled up the story, and it goes, during one such raid, the women and children were sent to the plateau for safety. When the men returned to retrieve them after the battle, their families had vanished without a trace. Searching the area, they found the snow and rocks stained with a blood-red substance. Terrified that evil spirits, or even giant hairy creatures akin to a Sasquatch, had devoured their loved ones, they declared the area forbidden. Modern science attributes the blood red snow to a perfectly natural phenomenon, a type of red algae or red lichen that thrives in subalpine environments. So despite its fame, historians and Comox elders have confirmed that this legend has no basis in actual indigenous history. The story was invented in the 1920s by Ben Hughes, editor of the Comox Argus, and Clinton Wood, a local tourism promoter. They crafted the indigenous curse to add a sense of mystery and allure to the region, hoping to attract more mainland tourists to the burgeoning ski and hiking destination. While the name Forbidden Plateau stuck, actual indigenous connection to the land is more practical. Elders have noted that their ancestors rarely traveled deep into the high-altitude plateau because their primary food sources, salmon and shellfish, were abundant at the coast. Today, the Forbidden Plateau is a part of Strathcona Provincial Park, while the ski lodge that once stood there burned down in 2002. The area remains a popular spot for backcountry hiking and snowboarding. Many local snowboarders and hikers still refer to the legend with a sense of cool detachment, viewing it as a piece of unique, if manufactured, Vancouver Island lore. So that's a cool little story, but I also, it's necessary to provide the disclaimer that it is a made-up story about Forbidden Plateau, but it was something that I had remembered and heard. I've camped out in Forbidden Plateau, for 2 weeks, 1 week, a few days over the years, and like multiple times, right? And there is something, a bit mysterious about the place. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, are these creatures real? Are they paranormal? How do they hide so well if they are real? This is the unexplained. And there was this, one time I was camping and we just heard like these rocks being thrown, and we were next to this, river. And, when it's not, too high, there's, massive like rocks that you can like walk along and stuff. And so it was getting a bit into the evening. I would say it's around 7 or 8 at night. And we just hear like these rocks being, thrown and smashed. And I had assumed, someone from our camp was down there throwing rocks for some reason, which also like probably wouldn't have been allowed anyways, because it's like salmon and fish. I don't know if salmon go there, but I know for sure there are fish in that river, and throwing rocks willy-nilly and that hard would have been a great disturbance, and probably would have been shut down by the people who were organizing the thing, right? So that's just like one thing. Like there are things that kind of go bump in the night. So at this same area we were camping in, it was summer, and like everyone was down at the river aside from a handful of people. And one of these people was a girl who was at the time, is a bit younger than me, probably by like a year or two younger than I am. And so at the time, I would have been, probably like a preteen, probably around preteen, 11 or 12 and 13 maybe. And, they were, would have been around, 10, 11, so she was back at the main camp area. And so at the main camp area, it's a gravel, road. And then there's, 1, 2, 3 cabins, and then, bathrooms. And then there's like the kitchen area where they have like a gas stove and like, things like that. Right. And so keep in mind that from the main camp area, depending on which way you go, it can be 10, 15, or even 20-minute walk from the main camp area. And so this girl, who was a bit younger than me, she was alone. Maybe there was one other person or 2 other people, but she was, essentially alone at the camp by herself. And so the indigenous, he's a medicine man, and he, side note, he's the one who, when we heard the rock smashing, he was like, "That's Bigfoot," and we're like all laughing. He's like, "No, like, it could be." But he calls everybody from, I'm trying to, it's been a while since I've like told this story and have like remembered it, so I'm pulling it from my memory right now. So either I don't think he called everybody, but when everybody got back from the river, he got everybody in a circle, and he told us, this experience that this girl went through. And so what the girl, told him was, she was, I think, going to the washroom or something, right? And she sees my sister, calling her name, like, "Hey, so-and-so, come here." And my sister runs into the forest. And this girl who was being called to go into the forest, I guess probably got like an uneasy feeling, but she didn't run into the forest. And it turns out that my sister was nowhere near the main camp at the time that this event occurred. She was, most likely, at the river with me, like swimming and stuff, right? And imagine this circumstance. Let's go into a first-person perspective. You're camping. You're young. You're like let's say you're like 11 years old, and like you're camping, with a bunch of family, friends, and cultural, connections, indigenous cultural connections, and like, it's a summer day, and you're just going to the washroom, and then someone that you're very close with tells you, "Hey, come here," and like, "Follow me," and runs off into the forest, wanting you to follow them. And you're like, I'm not going to do that. And then you find out a bit later that that very close person to you wasn't anywhere near where that event occurred, which means that, probably a skinwalker had shapeshifted to look like someone that she trusts, and, listened to my sister speak in order to mimic their voice, and attempted to lure, this young person into the forest. For whatever reason, I do not know. But even telling this story it gives me like a very unsettled, very kind of like, icky feeling. Because this is something that actually happened. Like, the girl who, this happened to has no, vested interest in spooking the camp, and neither does the medicine man. Ideally, like, like, they don't have any self-vested interest in, like, creating, boogeyman stories. But that's a very, it's very concerning that happened, paranormal event. Because, like, you can listen online and you can read stories of, what people call mimics or skinwalkers or, Wendigo. And, what these, so the idea of the mimic is literally just this. It doesn't have voice. It doesn't understand the words it's saying. It just repeats, what it hears, and it kind of mimics, shapeshifts, what it sees. So when people encounter a mimic, from what I've heard, I haven't heard of anyone personal to me, or, in my own experience, per se. But the idea is this: you're, out camping with your friends, and, a mimic hears someone say something, and then the mimic goes up to a vulnerable person, which is someone who's alone out in the wild. Maybe their friends are off a bit farther somewhere fishing or something, and they're just alone somewhere at the camp or whatever. And, they're like, "Hey, come here." Like, they're saying the words, or they're mimicking, the words, but there's no meaning behind the words. When someone gets super passionate about something and there's a meaning, there's a feeling behind the words. These are almost like a disembodied voice that they, hear, that they encounter, that's coming from this mimic. Imagine you're camping, with a sibling. I'm going to use my sister as an example. So imagine, I'm with my sister, and, she's like, "Okay, I'm going to go off and, like, go jump in the water. Or I'm going to go over there and, like, pick some berries or something," right? And they go off. She goes off, and I'm, like, alone. And then, a bit time later, she comes back, but there's something off. And, she's like, "Hey, come over here." And I can tell that, maybe this isn't who they say they are. This isn't what they look like. Maybe there's something a bit off. And then I notice in their voice, there's something off about their voice. And it's almost like I'm listening to a recording of the voice, or, that's not, her voice. And that's kind of what I imagine a mimic to be like. And what they do, I don't know. The point, the reason why they want to lure people, to be alone, is it to kill them? Is it, what is it? I don't know. And if we come back to this real story of this girl who encountered my sister, who told her to come follow her into the forest, and then it turns out that it wasn't my sister, and that my sister was confirmed to be, like, 15 minutes away at the river. What was the intention? What was, the plan? Like, let's say this girl did follow my quote-unquote sister into the forest. What would have happened to her? And that's where the eerie feeling, the feeling of unsettledness comes from. We don't know. At least I don't know. And so then, like, Skinwalker, it seems to be, from the stories that I've heard online, it seems to be something that can mimic you, can shapeshift. And I think even in the Navajo perspective on skinwalkers and how they came to be, is skinwalkers, and, feel free to correct me, but there's, in general, there's certain indigenous nations who believe that the skinwalker is actually a witch. And how you become a skinwalker is by eating another human being. And so in the Navajo tradition, a skinwalker is not a spirit or a random monster, but a human witch who has attained a high level of priesthood and chosen to use their power for bad medicine. To become a skinwalker, a person must commit the ultimate act of evil, the murder of a close family member, usually a sibling. Initiation rituals are said to involve cannibalism and necrophilia in secret caves to permanently sever the witch's connection to humanity. The name, and I'm going to attempt to say this to the best of my ability. Yi Naldushi translates to, with it, he goes on all fours. By wearing the pelt of an animal, most commonly a coyote, wolf, or bear, they can physically transform into that creature. The Navajo are famously reluctant to speak about skinwalkers with outsiders, as many believe that even saying the name can draw their attention, which is why I've been told, probably shouldn't say skinwalker, or, well, actually, not even probably, don't say it. And I'm only saying it because, for the sake of the podcast episode, so you know what I'm talking about. And I'm going to tell you, listener, do not say that word, please, out of respect for, the cultural traditions and out of sake of your own safety. You don't want, things that go bump in the night. I don't know if you just heard that, but something clicked. It sounded almost like a pop can. You don't want things, tapping on your window at night, or if you're on a walk, seeing crazy things, So what's the difference between a skinwalker and a Wendigo? People often confuse the two, but they come from different regions and have different origins. So the skinwalker comes from the Navajo or the southwestern USA. The Wendigo typically comes from, Algonquin tribes, Canada, and the northern US. The nature of a skinwalker is a human witch who chooses evil, and the nature of a Wendigo is a human possessed by spirit of greed or hunger. Cannibalism, a ritual act to gain power, for a skinwalker, and the Wendigo, a desperate act that triggers the curse. And the appearance of a skinwalker, an animal with human-like eyes, and the appearance of a Wendigo is a gaunt, skeletal giant with the scent of decay. So there's also, there's modern internet lore, Fleshgate, which is Fleshgait, Fleshgate, or not deer. In recent years, internet horror stories like those found on Creepypasta have blended these indigenous legends into new entities like Fleshgates. These stories often describe creatures that mimic human voices perfectly but have distorted bodies, such as deer that stand on two legs, or family members who don't look quite right. While popular online, these are generally considered modern urban legends rather than traditional indigenous folklore. So, these entities, seem to be of, an evil nature. And, this mimic that this girl saw at the camp, it seems to be, of a malicious nature. Because even if this entity that, this girl saw, who mimicked the appearance and voice of my sister and wanted her to follow her into the forest, even if this, entity didn't attack this girl, may have gotten easily lost and either not found at all, or it would have been, harder to find. Because, one minute she's just, hanging out at the camp in the bathroom, then the next she's running into the forest, chasing this thing, and then she ends up lost. So, what these are, I don't know. It's the unexplained. And in West Coast and North Coast indigenous traditions, the mimic is often identified as the Kushtaka, or the Zunukwa. Oh, Zunukwa. I know the Zunukwa. We were told stories of the Zunukwa, where if we are bad, or I think this is the story. Like, if we're bad, then like the Zunukwa will, come take us to her like house. And there's a indigenous story which I'll get into in a sec. So the Kushtaka, or perhaps the most famous mimics of the North Coast, specifically in Tlingit and Haida folklore. They are supernatural shapeshifters that appear as a cross between a human and a land otter. They are known to mimic the cries of a distressed infant or a screaming woman to lure people towards the water's edge. Their goal is often to, quote-unquote, save the person from drowning or freezing by turning them into a Kushtaka themselves, effectively stealing their soul. And the Zunukwa, known as the Wild Woman of the Woods, Zunukwa is a towering cannibal giant from Kwakwaka'wakw mythology. She is often described as clumsy and half asleep, but she uses a distinct hoo-hoo call to attract children. In some legends, she mimics the voice of a child's grandmother to trick them into coming closer so she can snatch them up and put them in her basket. While terrifying, she is also associated with wealth and copper. In some stories, heroes outwit her to gain her treasures. Across nearly all Northwest Coast cultures, Raven is the ultimate trickster and shapeshifter in both biological reality and mythology. Ravens are incredibly intelligent and can imitate almost any sound, including human speech.